Today we're going to be in conversation about what was called the Operation Condor. Operation Condor was initiated out of Chile during the rule of Augusto Pinochet that sought to eliminate political opponents who had escaped and fled to other countries, mostly other South American countries, but it also included the United States and parts of Europe. Eventually, other South American countries would also take the precedent set by Operation Condor to eliminate their own political opponents. We will be in conversation as well about attempts to bring justice to those who perpetuated such a program. My guest for this is Dr. Francesca Lessa. Francesca Lessa is the Departmental Lecturer in Latin American Studies and Development at Oxford University, and she is the author of the book The Condor Trials, Transnational Repression and Human Rights in South America. Francesca Lessa, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
Important history here to begin with. Tell me, what was Operation Condor?
Operation Condor was a secret pact between several military dictatorships in South America. The founding date of Operation Condor is November 1975, when, during an intelligence meeting that was hosted in Santiago in Chile, and that had been organized by General Manuel Contreras, who was at the time the head of the Chilean secret police. General Contreras hosted over 50 representatives of intelligence from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil. And as part of this first meeting of intelligence in Chile, they decided to establish formally Operation Condor, which was meant to be a system that would enable these military regimes to more efficiently and effectively persecute those political opponents that had been living in exile across South America for quite some time and had been particularly successful at creating international campaigns that were keeping under the spotlight the atrocities that the military regime of Pinochet, but also the dictatorship in Uruguay, in Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia had been perpetrating for a number of years already. And so the objective of Operation Condor was to enable these military regimes to basically pull together their resources in order to more efficiently track down, detain, interrogate, and later, in at least half of the cases, disappear or murder these political opponents, while approximately another half were released afterwards, but only after suffering horrific torture and inhuman condition of detention. Operation Condor, we could say that was basically the culmination of pre-existing practices, because of course it would be unrealistic to think that such a ambitious and comprehensive system would just emerge from one meeting in 1975. We need to look back all the way to at least 1969, when we had the first few cases of repression of political exiles. In those cases, it was specifically Brazilian political refugees who were living in nearby Uruguay, who were arrested in Uruguay and sent back through clandestine renditions to their native Brazil. And so from these early cases, we start to see a sort of growing levels of collaborations between the military governments all across the region that over time sort of sharpened their practices and their channels of coordination in such a way that this enabled them by late 1975 to effectively set up this sophisticated system of transnational repression that was called Operation Condor.
That's interesting,
And
that the precursor was in Brazil in 1969. What's happening in South America for something like this to come out of?
So the context that we need to think about in order to better understand Condor is on the one hand, the geopolitical context of the global Cold War, where we have the confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. And in this context, South America as a region was considered to be under the sphere of influence of the United States, and many people colloquially say that South America was in the US backyard. So it fell under this sphere of influence. And so in this context of the global Cold War, we see already since the 1950s, the spread of the national security doctrine that was emerging from the United States and that was quickly adopted all across South America, but also Central America. And according to the national security doctrine, we see that the achievement of national security is considered to be the foremost objective for these governments. And when I say foremost, it's quite literal in the sense that almost anything was acceptable, including the perpetration of systematic human rights violations, disappearances, torture, sexual violence, the appropriation of children, all crimes against humanity that were committed in the name of national security and in the name of the fight against subversion to prevent the infiltration of communism all across South America. And so this is really the context and the sort of background against which we can begin to see why these practices that all of us would consider abhorrent were in fact being perpetrated on a systematic basis all across the region. And the coordination in these practices was so strong that we see the emergence of something such as Operation Condor that would be unthinkable for those of us that have studied international politics, because we know how states are very jealous of their national borders, of their territorial integrity and their sovereignty. And so to even think that states would come together in order to effectively remove these borders so that military and police officers from the different countries could go after these political exiles is something that at the time was quite unprecedented, although unfortunately it's a practice that we still see happening today.
So this is specifically about exiles, people in exiles, and hence the transnational nature to it.
Exactly. So we have two dynamics that are taking place simultaneously. The first one is political repression within the borders of each of the South American states. We have the first or one of the earliest military coups taking place in Paraguay in 1954. Then we have the coup in Brazil in 1954. In Bolivia in 1971, in Chile and Uruguay in 1973, and also Argentina in 1976. So we have a sort of wave, a sort of domino effect of military coups taking place across the region. And all of these countries brutally repressed all form of internal opposition, whether it was armed groups such as the Uruguayan Tupamaros or the Argentine Montoneros, but also any form of peaceful political and social opposition as well. So we have many victims who were politicians, who were trade union activists, who were students, journalists, or just workers. So we have a first dynamic whereby the military dictatorships, in order to impose their political and economic projects, are very brutal in the repression of human rights of the local population. But then the second dynamic that takes place at the same time is that, because as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we had these coups at different times taking place across the region. We had exiles moving across the different countries, leaving their country of origin in search of safety. generally staying nearby. So many Paraguayans emigrated to Argentina, for example. Many Brazilians also went to Uruguay. But then when there was also a coup in Uruguay, both the Brazilians living there and Uruguayans migrated to Chile. And then when the coup happened in Chile, these thousands of refugees traveled onwards to Argentina. So we have quite a movement of political exiles taking place. And this is why we have the second dynamic whereby the military dictatorships want to also silence the critical voices of these exiles that were being very active at putting under the spotlight the crimes of the military dictatorship.
Yeah, that timeline is really important to understand. As you were talking about, Chile and Argentina would be at the later end of that timeline in the 1970s when they would have their military dictatorship. And then once Augusto Pinochet came to power in Chile and the military came to power in Argentina, I guess especially with Argentina, these people now had nowhere else to go.
That's exactly right. It's a great summary of these dynamics. And in fact, one of the findings of my research was that Argentina was actually, well, on the one hand, the country that hosted the largest number of refugees because of the timeline that you just mentioned, but also because of a long tradition of being a safe haven for refugees. If we think back to the beginning of the 20th century, we have thousands of people, especially anarchists from Italy and Spain that sought refuge in Argentina, but also many Spanish who were fleeing the civil war in Spain in the 1930s. So Argentina also had a strong tradition of providing refuge to political opponents. And so because of this tradition, but also the fact that Argentina, despite having military coups also in 1966 and earlier in the 50s, as part of this latest wave, it was the country that had the sort of the latest coup in March 1976. And so by that time, Amnesty International estimated that about 100,000 refugees, and they say it's a conservative number, so it was probably quite much higher than that, but still they estimated at least 100,000 refugees living in Argentina. And by that point, as you mentioned, they literally had nowhere else to go because all around South America, they were surrounded by military regimes. And only a few of them were able to flee either to Mexico or Venezuela or to friendly European countries such as France, Italy, or Sweden that were receiving many of the refugees. And so I want to just quote quickly a very powerful sentence that was written in one of the trials in Argentina, specifically about Operation Condor. The judges in the trial say that Argentina was transformed from a safe haven where refugees had been safe for a long time to actually a hunting ground where they were basically trapped in. And I think it's a very powerful sentence that summarizes exactly what happened to many of the South American refugees at the time.
Is that what we mean when we hear about the disappeared of Argentina?
So yeah, indeed, that's part of the story of the disappeared in Argentina. Argentina has become known because of its association with the practice of disappearances that predates the military dictatorship in Argentina, going back all the way to Nazi Germany. But I think it's become quite strongly associated with what happened in Argentina. And certainly disappearances were one of the methods used as part of Operation Condor, but it was the central, I would say, tool of repression also at the domestic level. In fact, there have been estimates of up to 30,000 people who have disappeared in Argentina, and also an estimated 500 disappeared children that were stolen literally upon birth from their mothers, who were held in captivity in this vast network of over 500 secret prisons that were being operated by the military and the police during the dictatorship. And so, in addition to the practice of disappearing the parents who were political or social activists, there was in parallel a systematic plan whereby newborns were also stolen and appropriated by families that were supportive of the military regime. And in fact, there is a paradoxical situation even at present time, that many of these 500 children are, in a sense, living disappeared because they have survived, but only 130 have been able, thanks to the efforts of the NGO Grandmothers of May Square, they've been able to recover their identity and be united with their biological families. But over 300 still don't know that they have been adopted, and they don't know that the families that they lived with actually appropriated them illegally as part of this plan.
These people, many of them would be middle-aged now.
Yeah, so they would be, I would say, maybe 3 to 4 years older than myself, because they were born between 1975 and 1983.
You begin your book with 2 children at a playground, suddenly showing up in a country not of their origin.
So that's exactly one of the stories of these stolen children, and one that is emblematic also of Operation Condor, because of this long journey that Anatole and Victoria Julien, these 2 brothers, who were born of Uruguayan parents but were abducted in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, when their family house came under attack in September 1976. And as part of the operation against the family house, their father was murdered and the mother was later disappeared. And the 2 brothers basically spent some time in one of these secret prisons in Argentina first, and then they were taken to Uruguay for about a couple of months, and subsequently to Chile, so a sort of third stop in this long journey that these brothers were forced to undertake as part of their abduction by the Argentine, Uruguayan, and military forces. And they were eventually abandoned in a public square in the port city of Valparaiso, Chile, where they were subsequently adopted by a Chilean family that, in this case specifically, was not connected to the military regime and was adopting them in good faith, and actually adopted. It was the only family that was willing to adopt both of them. And because the 2 brothers were so connected to each other and they didn't want to let go of each other, the judge assigned the 2 brothers to this family because they were willing to take both of them home. And this story is extremely powerful because it clearly shows, on the one hand, the sort of the geographical spread of Operation Condor, because it just seems unthinkable that 2 toddlers, Anatole was 4 years old and Victoria just a year and a half, could undergo such a ordeal, being taken across 3 countries, and then subsequently abandoned just in a public square. And only the structures of Operation Condor, so these systems of joint operations, intelligent exchange, and the possibility of moving prisoners, because they were prisoners of the security forces, freely across the borders of 3 countries, explains what's happened to these brothers. But their case is also important, not because it embodies this system of transnational repression, but also because of the tireless efforts that the two brothers undertook in order to obtain justice. And it's been a long journey, but finally, in the past couple of years, they've been able to obtain a number of verdicts, both in Argentina and Uruguay, but also from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that has recognized the violation of their human rights as well as the crimes that their parents suffered back in 1976.
And what did that mean, winning those cases?
So for both of the brothers, I was able to interview one of them, Anatole. For them, the achievement of justice is fundamental for the construction of memory. Of course, there is a personal struggle in terms of having one's rights vindicated and having the recognition that their rights and the rights of their parents were violated at the time of the military dictatorship, but also a commitment to establishing guarantees of non-repetition, to making sure that similar crimes never happen again in the future. And so justice is really understood as one of the steps that enable to create social awareness and social knowledge about these systematic atrocities as a way to ensure prevention and that no one else in the future has to experience similar atrocities such as their family has had to endure. And so the fact that these verdicts clearly recognize on the one hand the perpetration of the crime, but also the existence of Operation Condor as the system that allowed for the perpetration of these crimes to take place is fundamental in giving all of us the tools that we need in trying to be aware about what are the mechanisms through which human rights violations can be perpetrated and how we need to always be aware of what is happening and trying to always be preventing this type of atrocities from taking place. Not only look into the past, but especially to the future as well.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Dr. Francesca Lessa. She's a departmental lecturer in Latin American Studies and Development at Oxford University, and author of the book The Condor Trials, Transnational Repression and Human Rights in South America. This is a struggle against forgetting, isn't it? And a big reason for that, among probably many reasons, but a big reason for that was the secrecy of Operation Condor itself. Not only did nobody acknowledge during its time of operation that it existed, but it would be a long time until we actually had proof that it existed.
That's exactly right. In fact, when I was interviewing some of the survivors, but also some of the relatives of victims, they told me very powerfully how back at the time it was very difficult to comprehend what was happening exactly in these specific cases of transnational repression. Because if you were an Argentine citizen going missing in Argentina, of course, it's a tragedy, but there was a level of certainty in the sense that one could begin to understand what was happening within the country in the context of the military dictatorship. And there were networks of human rights groups and activists that were helping victims' relatives to look for their loved ones, to file habeas corpus petitions, to go to hospitals, to go to prisons, and try to at least attempt to locate their missing loved ones. But if we think about the cases of transnational repression, this picture, which is already complicated at the national level, acquires even more levels of difficulties. So I'll give you an example. I remember talking to the relative of a Chilean victim who went missing in Argentina. And so when his sister was trying to file a habeas corpus petition in Chile where she was, to denounce the fact that her brother was missing, authorities could just easily say, well, your brother was missing in Argentina. Why are you asking us to help you? This is nothing to do with us. How can you expect us to help you? You should go to Argentina, which of course was not so easy at the time during two military regimes. So this transnational element contributed to an additional level of secrecy and impunity, which already existed at the national level because, of course, all of these regimes systematically denied that people were disappearing. They would always say that people had left, they had gone abroad, they had begun a new life. So there was never an acknowledgement that there was a practice of disappearance implemented at the state level. And so when we add this element of transnational repression, families were completely lost as to what they could do in order to even begin to find out what had happened to their loved ones. And in fact, the justification that many of the local authorities would say that they had nothing to do with what was happening in Argentina was in fact far from the truth, because now we know that in the vast majority of these operations, victims were abducted by transnational hit squads. So in the case of Chile that I just mentioned, Chilean victims were abducted in operations carried out together by Argentine and Chilean agents, and then the Chilean victims would be taken back to Chile. So in fact, there was a very much of a shared responsibility in the perpetration of these atrocities. These foreign individuals were not going missing by chance. They were going missing specifically because of their political activism that was linked back to their country of origin. And in fact, many of them were later found in secret graves in their own countries of origin. But even so now
they were brought back. They were brought back by the military government to their country of origin, murdered and then buried.
Exactly, yes. So many of them were brought back. Some were potentially killed in Argentina, but many of them were brought back. So with the information that we have available now, we have, of course, a much clearer picture of how the Condor system worked in practice. But at the time, it was very difficult for victims, relatives, and survivors to understand these dynamics. But they were nonetheless very active at denouncing what was happening. They didn't know it was called Condor, but they knew that something different was going on, that they had been able to see or to hear from their relatives before they were disappeared, and their relatives would say that they had seen people from their country of origin, that they were being monitored, and that they knew that there was a level of cooperation going on. In particular, I want to mention briefly the case of a Uruguayan journalist that was one of the survivors of one of the operations in 1976 in Argentina. And he was able already in 1977, so still at the time in which Operation Condor was at its peak, to actually denounce before Amnesty International what had happened to him, who had gone missing in Argentina, where he had traveled in trying to find his own son who had disappeared. And he ended up disappearing himself as part of his search. And he was reunited with the son, and both of them, alongside another 20 Uruguayan exiles, were taken back to Uruguay on a secret flight, so sort of rendition flights that we've come to know also in recent years. And because he was a renowned journalist, probably retired at the time, and also coming from a conservative background, the military in Uruguay ended up releasing this journalist while the son was sent to jail for a number of years. And so, at great personal risk, this journalist went back to Argentina, where he had been abducted. He basically retraced the steps of everything that had happened to him and the other exiles. And with all of this evidence, then traveled to London, to Amnesty International, to tell the world in a press release that was organized in 1977 about what was happening in Argentina. And although, again, we didn't know it was called Condor until the early 1990s, these survivors already at the time began denouncing these practices of collaboration between the military dictatorships and the clandestine renditions that were taking place.
Yeah, he broke into government offices, didn't he, to get those documents?
So at the time, I think he mainly relied on connections with local exiles and NGOs. So he didn't have access to government documents, but he was able to take a photo from the outside of the secret detention center where he had been held alongside the other Uruguayans. And so he brought that as part of the evidence to Amnesty and also to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights.
Talking about the transnational nature of Operation Condor, and obviously it's by design. The military governments realize if these people are taken to another country, then gives them a sense of, I guess, impunity. It was hard not to think about the United States and its war on terrorism. I just started thinking about CIA black sites, or even Guantanamo Bay, which was set up as a detention facility because it wasn't within the United States. I mean, Supreme Court made some rulings that they should still have access to habeas corpus. It hasn't necessarily happened, but I'm sure there's some differences, but still reminded me, I mean, this of similar practices, I guess.
Undoubtedly, it's very sad to see how many of the practices that we've seen, not only in Guantanamo, but also I'm thinking about the Abu Ghraib scandal back in the mid-2000s, but also the clandestine rendition flights to other black sites in Libya or in Syria, how the context has changed, but there are so many continuities. On the one hand, the construction of the enemy. At the time, it was the communist subversion. At the present, the terrorism and often Islamic terrorism. And the malleability of these concepts to the point that almost anyone can suddenly be accused of either being a subversive or a terrorist with no evidence, with no opportunity of a fair trial, and with practices that are very similar in the sense of having illegal abductions, clandestine flights, the use of black sites or torture centers, as they were called in Argentina, but they are effectively the same places that exist outside the margins of the law, where prisoners are kept with no respect for their human rights, and they suffer some of the most brutal tortures that one can imagine, and where there's literally no opportunity for accountability. And so we see, unfortunately, that some of these practices continue to reappear and continue to take place nowadays. Guantanamo is still functioning, despite many attempts to close it.
Do you see other examples of it today? Beyond sort of U.S. ongoing, it almost feels like the war on terror has ended, but it hasn't. But beyond the war on terror, do you see other examples of this kind of activity?
Well, I would like to say no, but unfortunately, there are many other examples. We have the cases, of course, of Syria and Egypt, where they are effectively authoritarian and dictatorial governments, where human rights violations against all types of oppositions and dissidents are routine. We have actually a case from an Italian researcher, so it's very close to my heart, that was conducting fieldwork for his PhD thesis in Egypt about the role of the trade unions. And suddenly he was accused of being a spy and was murdered in one of the torture centers in Cairo. And his parents have now undertaken a similar journey to the ones of South American victims in trying to achieve some justice for his murder. And we have even cases in Europe with Belarus, with the crash of political opposition that has been taking place for many years, and the disappearance of journalists and political opponents. So whether it's at the transnational or national level, unfortunately, many authoritarian regimes have continued to use these practices as part of their efforts to silence any form of opposition to their authoritarian rule.
Was the United States involved in Operation Condor?
Well, that's a difficult question and one that we don't have a sort of clear yes or no answer that I can give you. What I can tell you is that certainly the United States was supportive of the military dictatorships in South America in many respects. First, ideologically, I mentioned a little while ago the national security doctrine that emerged from the United States as being the broader framework that inspired the South American dictatorships, and that is behind the systematic human rights violations that we have been discussing. But we also have economic and military support. At the time, the US was providing millions in military equipment and in finance to the military dictatorships, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil. There was also an element of active collaboration in the training of South American security forces. We had numerous officers from USAID traveling to South America, especially to Uruguay, to train police forces that were then involved in this so-called counterinsurgency operations against the guerrillas. And they received training in torture techniques that were then applied as part of the brutal repression that was implemented against the guerrillas. And we also had, of course, the infamous School of the Americas, where hundreds of Latin American officers again received training in these so-called counterinsurgency and interrogation techniques. With regard to Operation Condor specifically, what we know is that certainly the US knew what was happening. We have a number of documents, both from the State Department, but also the CIA and FBI, dating all the way back to 1974, that already discussed the collaboration between the military dictatorships at the time. And then starting in 1976, mention Operation Condor specifically. In fact, the terminology of Operation Condor comes from the US declassified documents, because in South America, they call it more simply Condor or Condor system. So Operation Condor itself does come from the declassified documents from the United States. And from these documents, especially the ones that were declassified in 2019, we were able to see that the US had a very detailed knowledge of all of the structures of Operation Condor, how it functioned, and what was also the destiny of the victims. There is a powerful document that discusses the abduction of this large group of Uruguayans that I was mentioning a little while ago, that were taken on a clandestine flight from Argentina back to Uruguay. And this document says very openly that these individuals would most likely be treated according to regular practices in Argentina, meaning that they would be killed. And then the document also says that the leaders of these groups had already been executed. So the level of knowledge was quite detailed and comprehensive. I don't think that the US actively participated in the operations. At least we do not have any evidence of that. The challenge is that even with declassified documents, we only get to see what the government decides that we can see. So we can only base our evaluation on that. And on the basis of what we have seen, there is no evidence of active participation. Certainly, there is evidence of omission, potentially, in not doing more, knowing about what was happening, in not trying to do more to protect the refugees or to stop these countries from continuing with their murderous plans. But we then also have a turning point with the murder of Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier, who was assassinated in Washington, D.C. in September 1976.
And that's striking. That is striking for Americans to learn. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think, and this is my own personal interpretation, that the US was potentially willing to tolerate Operation Condor until it sort of stayed within South America. But when they saw that the South American regimes were actually moving beyond their region with Letelier, but also with another number of operations planned for Europe. We have seen evidence of actually agents being on the ground in France to murder Uruguayan exiles there. I think that's when the US decided that some kind of line had been crossed by the military regimes, and certainly by Pinochet, that had been one of their allies until then. And in fact, we see that already starting in 1977, Operation Condor starts to lose its steam, and particularly Manuel Contreras, the head of the DINA, the Chilean secret police, and the DINA itself are shut down as a result of US pressure because of the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington. And so, again, it's a very complicated answer to your question, but I think that the US, because of the context of the global Cold War, was willing to potentially tolerate up to a certain level, but then they clearly, after Letelier's murder, began to demarcate much more strongly what was acceptable or not in their view.
In the trials concerning Operation Condor in more recent years, there's been a real desire to have Henry Kissinger testify at these.
So, yeah, it's quite an interesting point. When I was in Buenos Aires monitoring one of these trials, this question was sort of the elephant in the room, the role of the US, the role of Kissinger in particular. And the challenge was that, of course, because we know that the United States doesn't extradite its own citizens, it was, of course, in a way, a moot question, because people knew that it was not going to be possible, but it was always there because, of course, all of these facilitating conditions that I mentioned, the ideology, the financing, the military equipment, of course, were enabling factors that the US provided the South American regimes, and that enabled the dictatorships to carry out this persecution of exiles and political opposition. And in particular, there is a document that has been classified already a number of years ago, which is a meeting between Kissinger and the Argentine Foreign Minister Guzzetti, where the foreign minister explains to Kissinger the issue of having so many thousands of refugees in Argentina and the fact that they were all potentially terrorists and undermining security and so on. And so there is a sort of tacit approval in the sense of, doing whatever Argentina needed to do, but trying to return to normality quite quickly. The so-called, I think it's called the green light document, with Kissinger saying, well, do what you need to do, but return to normality quickly, which I think was taken, certainly at the time, as a green light to the Argentine dictatorship to be...
Just don't make it difficult for us. Do what you got to do, but...
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And in fact,
because there are Democrats, I think, in Congress who were concerned about human rights violations.
Yes, exactly. And we have the case of Senator Ed Koch that was able to pass, to promote and to have the amendment voted by Congress, which cut military aid to Uruguay in late 1976. And the amendment was based, amongst other things, on the testimony that I mentioned of the Uruguayan journalist who had been abducted as part of Operation Condor. That was one of the many thousand human rights violations that had been taken place. But this amendment that cut military aid was especially justified on the very, very, very dire human rights record that Uruguay had at the time.
Are the trials ongoing?
They are. There are still a number of trials ongoing and also new ones beginning. We have had so far over 40 trials that specifically focused on Operation Condor atrocities. Some of the biggest ones took place in Argentina, in Italy, and in Chile, but there have also been smaller ones in Uruguay, Paraguay, the US as well, where there were several cases regarding the assassination of Orlando Letelier. And we also have new cases beginning all the time. There is a new trial in Italy that will begin in July this year. And there is also at the moment another trial in Uruguay that has been just a couple of days ago. Some of the latest appeals to the Supreme Court have been rejected. And so the next step is likely to be the formal beginning of this trial that will investigate the cases of a number of Uruguayan victims who were killed, executed, and kidnapped in Argentina. So this is very much an ongoing process, and it's been actually catalyzed by some of the historic verdicts that were handed down in Argentina and in Italy over the past couple of years.
I suspect many who were responsible for Operation Condor at the highest levels are no longer alive. Have any of them been held to account for the operation? I know Augusto Pinochet was arrested and tried. Was that a part of what happened to him?
So he was indicted in the Chilean Condor case in 2004. But unfortunately, he was then the case was then dismissed because of his ill health. But several others have been prosecuted and sentenced, including Manuel Contreras, the head of the secret police. He was actually one of the first to be sentenced back in 1995 for the murder of Orlando Letelier. So again, there, the pressure from the US was positive in the sense of getting the Chilean courts to prosecute this very high profile. He was the second in command after Pinochet, effectively, and he was sentenced already in the mid-1990s. But since then, we've had many other former dictators that have been sentenced. Most recently in Argentina in 2016, dictator Reinaldo Vignone was sentenced in the Operation Condor trial. We also had a former foreign minister of Uruguay that was sentenced in the Italian Condor trial, alongside a former president of Peru and the head of intelligence as well. Several high-profile leaders of the different military regimes have been prosecuted, and also many of the so-called middle and lower rank officers who basically implemented on the ground this plan of human rights repression and conducted the murders, the abductions, and the torture as well. So I've calculated that so far over 100 between civilian and military leaders from Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Paraguay have been held accountable specifically for crimes committed within Operation Condor.
Francesca Lessa has been our guest. She's Departmental Lecturer in Latin American Studies and Development at Oxford University, and she has joined us for a conversation about her book. It's called The Condor Trials, Transnational Repression and Human Rights in South America. Dr. Lessa, that was quite informative, and I thank you dearly for taking this time to join me today.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and it was great to be in the program.